Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Vraks. And not just any old battlefield this time, but the final Vraksian citadel. The source of all that ails this poor, once loyal planet. The Basilica of St. Leonis, the high command structure of the Vraksian PDF and Labour Auxilia forces, and of course the less savoury residences of the cornered warlord Zufor and his new loyal followers. This was the last bastion of the Vraksian uprising. When it was finally brought to its knees, the war on Vraks, which had lasted for a torturous 18 years, would finally be over. But it would require one last Herculean effort on behalf of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army to finally breach this fortification. It was the oldest and the most expensively developed of all the fortresses situated on Vraks. Standing atop a nigh impossible cliff, it would have to be assaulted by massed infantry formations, fighting their way up the steep cliff sides and the handful of approaches meter by meter, whilst constantly under fire by innumerable artillery batteries, both light and heavy, and of course the various wall-mounted defences. Autocannons, missile launchers, mortars, bombards, heavy bolters, stubbers, and every last las and autogun that the defenders could marshal. And due to the limited access routes, only a single regiment could assault the massive edifice at a time. And the choice of the first regiment to be hurled against it was the 261st, commanded by Colonel Tybork, hero of Fort A453. The selection of the 261st, and in particular of Colonel Tybork, was a symbolic gesture, and in part also an affectionate one on behalf of Lord Inquisitor Hector Rex. It was a recognition of the 88's long and bloody history on Vraks, and of the fact that those who had once started the war would now have a chance to finish it. Although no one truly believed that the 261st alone would be able to break open the citadel. No one would be so uncouth as to put it into words, but pretty much everyone recognized that after the 261st had almost inevitably been shattered against the citadel's walls, another regiment would be fed into the grinder, and then another, and then another, and then another, until the job would finally be complete. But such gloomy thoughts went above Colonel Tybork's pay grade. All he had to concern himself was to make the most out of his regiment's turn up the line, and so he devised a plan based in part of Lord Commander Julka's own ideas. The entire regiment would be committed en masse in a single, massive three-pronged assault. Nothing would be held back, and no reserves would be kept by the 261st. Reserves was for unexpected developments, sudden breakthroughs, or enemy counterattacks, and Colonel Tybork did not expect either to be a particularly large concern. If one of the three prongs was shattered by a counterattack, well, so be it. The other regiments were nearby and would be able to stop any attempted breakthrough without much in the way of trouble. And Colonel Tybork had long since resigned himself to the fact that this assault would almost certainly be the death of his regiment. Thusly, there really was nothing to be gained by keeping reserves. All it would do was dilute his forward elements and force him to feed his troops into the meat grinder piecemeal, instead of making the most of his regiment's strength while he still possessed it. But before we look at Colonel Tybork's plan, we first need to look at the defences he was up against. This is the Vraksian citadel. The red areas denote larger and smaller gun batteries, along with bunkers and fixed emplacements. There are also, of course, the walls surrounding the entire compound and leading off to smaller resistance nest, massive armoured towers equipped with heavy gun batteries and automated defences. The vast majority of the area surrounding the citadel is completely impassable, blocked by steep cliffs and natural obstacles. The only way in or out is through 4 large roadways, all of them defended by multiple gun batteries and, of course, mined quite thoroughly. The artillery bombardment, which at this point had lasted for 2 months, was expected to have cleared out a fair few of the explosive surprises. A second, more directed artillery bombardment would focus on the avenues of approach that Colonel Tyborg designated. This would clear out yet more, and engineer formations would be operating throughout the night preceding the assault to clear out as many mines as possible, and also to remove any further obstacles placed along the roadway by the Vraksian defenders, such as tank traps or ditches. The Gorgon heavy assault transports would not care overmuch if the road was heavily pockmarked by artillery shells, and as for the tanks, well, they would be unable to support the first assaults anyways, and so there would be plenty of time to repair any overly egregious damages to allow the tanks to approach later. But for now, the infantry would have to do most of the heavy lifting. But before the dying and the God Emperor's name could commence, one final preparatory bombardment would be launched. Colonel Tyborg had already been in communication with the various artillery officers, instructing them as to where he would like to see them concentrate their shelling and what he hoped to see them achieve. The primary objective, of course, would be to clear the approach routes so that the heavy assault transports could carry the infantry into assault range. Secondary priority should then be given to stripping the walls of as many of their automated defences and emplaced guns as possible. And as a third and final objective, if the guns could be so kind as to smash a hole or two in those walls, or even better, in the massive gatehouses, then that too would be quite lovely. For otherwise, the infantry would have to blast them open on foot. This would necessitate the deployment of Death Corps engineers with specialized detonation packs and shaped charges, and would also require a lot of time. Time which the assaulting elements would then have to spend sitting prettily outside of the walls, fully exposed to their defenses. Now granted, at this point, the 15,000 guns of the 88th had been bombarding the fortifications for nigh on 2 months, and one may be excused for wondering what one more bombardment could possibly achieve. But, well, the Death Corps of Krieg is not the questioning sort. And besides, a touch of light support shelling has never hurt anyone. Except for the people it kills, of course. And after the barrage, the assault would begin in earnest. It was a mighty bombardment, the kind that makes even Death Corps guardsmen look up at it and wonder, could anything truly survive that? In despite of the fact that they know that that query will be answered with a resounding yes in a very short period of time. And the first group of poor bastard guardsmen to receive that yes was a diversionary attack up the northern slopes. This was an ad hoc formation made up of various elements of the other companies of the 261st. The men had been specifically selected for their skills at skirmishing and marksmanship. They would form an improvised light infantry formation that would attempt to make their way up the northern slopes, outfitted with specialized climbing equipment and weaponry. They would attempt to convince the defenders that the Death Corps' main attempt would be made towards the Basilica of St. Leonis. It was hoped that the perceived spiritual importance of the Basilica would convince the defenders that the Death Corps really were crazy enough to try and take it, despite having to do so up the near impassable slopes of the northern side, and thusly redeploy considerable numbers of troops to counter this perceived threat. Once the skirmishers were fully engaged, the first company would then move up, At first they would pretend to reinforce the light infantry, but as they came within range of the enemy's defences, they would then swerve off and make a beeline straight towards the Cardinal Gate. The first company would be supported by Gorgon heavy assault carriers, and they would lay down a withering covering fire. It was hoped that most of the enemy's defenders would at this point have been deployed to defend the Basilica, leaving the gate open to a sudden assault. Then, leaving just barely enough time for the enemy to react, the 7th Company would launch their attack upon the lower gates. This was expected to be the least heavily defended of the day's 3 objectives, and it was also expected that when the enemy realized that they were under attack on 2 completely separate areas of the citadel, they might be thrown into confusion as to which attack was truly the real one. And with 2 full companies and an additional large force of light infantry assaulting the citadel from 2 different directions, it was hoped that the enemy would now commit his reserves. And after allowing for yet another lengthy period of time to pass to convince the enemy that this truly was the full force of the assault, Colonel Tyborg would then mount his Gorgon and lead the 15th Company towards the 3rd and final objective of the day, the Great Gate. The 15th Company would rush towards its objective as quickly as possible. Relying on the enemy having already deployed their reinforcements, they would seize the outer defensive towers and then make towards the gate. Once the outer defences had been cleared out, Atlas recovery vehicles would be moved up. They would begin repairing the roadway approach to the gate and clearing out any remaining mines, after which the 5th Armoured Company would be sent in to support the Grenadiers of the 15th Company. The armoured vehicles would have to proceed up the sole approach route in single file, and any tank that got knocked out would simply have to be pushed straight off the precipice by the following tank. It would be a brutal and careless approach, but with the arrival of the armoured elements, they could use their heavier weaponry to blast open the gates and allow the Grenadiers passage through the Great Gate. If this was achieved, then the Grenadiers could quickly fan north and south along the walls, knocking out gun emplacements and routing the defenders as they went, along with establishing a defensive perimeter inside of the gate. Once this was achieved, the company would then vox back, and the entirety of the 88th Siege Army would pour into that opening like a never-ending flood, sealing the fate of the final Vraksian citadel. As far as plans go, it certainly wasn't a bad one, and as far as plans meant to assault a nigh-on impenetrable fortress went, it was actually a fairly good one. If the enemy was so cooperative as to move in the way that Colonel Tyborg wished, then maybe, just maybe, the Great Gate could be breached. And once it was down, the game was pretty much up for the defenders. And the assault upon the Basilica of St. Leonis was a particularly nice touch, both because the defenders, regardless of whether or not they had now gone fully chaotic or still under the command of the Cardinal, would almost certainly expect the Imperials to make a concerted effort towards what they expected them to think of as the primary objective. And considering the loud and vehement objections on the behalf of the ecclesiarchy in the months preceding the assault, they were not necessarily wrong either. And if the Cardinal was still in command, it was an even better bet that he would concentrate the majority of his forces to defend what he viewed as the seat of his power. And when then suddenly apparent reinforcements turn and instead attack the Cardinal Gate, an attack that is then swiftly followed by another attack upon the seemingly relatively unimportant lower gates, a man like the Cardinal might swiftly panic and place far more value on stopping these attacks than necessary. And hey, Lord Inquisitor Hector X had been getting really lucky for quite a while now, and perhaps some of that luck would rub off on Colonel Tyborg. And finally, the date set for the great first assault rolled around. Colonel Tyborg had organized his men. The first wave would be the light infantry making their way up the northern face. Then behind them would come the 3 companies in staggered series, with Gorgons leading the charge, with yet more foot infantry following up behind the Gorgons. The Gorgons would get as close as they could before either being knocked out or running into impassable terrain. Then it was up to the Grenadier elites aboard the Gorgons to charge out and seize whatever terrain they could, to bring up the infantry, which would then expand upon the gains by the Grenadiers. And so, meter by tortuous meter, the 261st would advance. But first, of course, all of the guardsmen got to take in the light show, as practically every single gun in the 88th opened up for the preliminary bombardment. And once the men were done enjoying the fireworks, the first lines of light infantry began to move towards the northern slopes of the citadel. And if you were so unlucky as to find yourself partaking in this attack, this is probably where you would want to be if you had some ridiculous ambitions of living throughout the day, because this diversionary attack was expected to simply look like a real threat to the citadel without ever actually being expected to be a real threat to the citadel, which meant they needed to keep their numbers up and avoid unnecessary casualties. They would be allowed to advance as they chose, when they chose, in whatever fashion they so chose, and they could defeat the various Vraksian positions in front of them piecemeal, whilst enjoying the full support of rear-line artillery and armoured elements. And once the light infantry had drawn an appropriate amount of attention from the defenders, the first company was sent in the apparent manoeuvre to reinforce them. Then the Gorgons broke off sharply and headed towards the Cardinal Gate. And this is when the fighting really got started. The appearance of the Gorgons and their apparent direction towards one of the main gates made the enemy aware that this was not merely some skirmishing attack or probe. This was going to be an all-out assault. And so, the heavy Vraksian artillery, still located within the citadel and inside of the walls, began hammering down upon the first company. It didn't take long until the Gorgons were fully bracketed by anti-tank weaponry and artillery of every sort. Heavy bolters, stubbers, and autocannon rounds rang harmlessly off the thick frontal assault ramps of the Gorgons, whilst artillery shells constantly boomed and burst overhead, showering the transports and the following infantry with red-hot shrapnel. Behind the Gorgons followed armoured elements that would advance as far as practical, whilst adding their own firepower to the advancing transports, and in amongst them was yet further infantry and centaur light carriers, dragging the regiment's light artillery pieces forward. These guns would soon deploy and begin showering the internal area of the citadel with high-explosive fragmentation rounds. And finally, all the way at the rear, the Grenadiers would move up behind the tanks and behind the light artillery. The 1st and 7th Company would let the Guardsmen occupy the Gorgons and take the brunt of the casualties, whilst the Grenadiers were expected to expand upon any ground they took, unlike the 15th Company, where the Grenadiers were expected to gain the vital ground and then guide in the reinforcements. Progress was, as expected, slow and bloody. The 1st Company was advancing in the face of one of the remaining laser defense batteries, and its primary armament had not been disabled by the 2-month bombardment nor by the preliminary bombardment. And so its monstrous primary ordnance, the anti-orbital laser defense weapon, was slowly yet unavoidably lowered to point towards the advance of the 1st Company. The massive weapon was designed to engage targets in orbit, and its gun depression was not ideal for engaging ground targets, and the 1st Company would soon be out of its line of fire. But until they were, the Vraksian defenders were intent on wreaking as much havoc as possible. and their first shot certainly signalled their intention loud and clear to the first company. The hugely fat iridescent beam of blinding energy shot out from the battery and played across the advanced elements of the first company, leaving 3 full Gorgon transports as no more than molten wrecks. The men they once carried reduced to nothing more than ashen particles scattered by the hot winds. Off to the southeast, the 7th Company was beginning their advance on the lower gates, and running into just as fierce, if not even fiercer, resistance. To begin with, everything seemed to be working out just fine for the 7th Company. They would be approaching the lower gates, a relatively lightly defended, it was assumed, objective, and they would be crossing ground that had already been cleared out by the artillery batteries. The outlying areas had been hammered for 2 full months, along with the citadel itself and its void shields, and the enemy's positions on the approach were all expected to have been annihilated. An expectation that was proven tragically and suddenly false, as the lead Gorgon transport of the 7th Company, containing within it the commander of the entire company, disappeared in a superheated ball of hot flame and plasma, as a bunker, expected to have been destroyed, fired upon it at point-blank range. And seconds later, the entire column of the 7th Company found itself under sustained and murderously precise fire from point-blank range. Most of the bunkers was still intact, and was now hosing down the entire formation with heavy bolter, stubber, rocket, and las cannon fire. The rest of the Gorgons immediately dropped their assault ramp in a desperate attempt to disgorge their infantry complement before they suffered the same fate as the lead transport. But within mere moments more, virtually all of the Gorgons were either burning or retreating, with only some of them having been able to deploy their guardsmen. And the following infantry element suffered even worse than the Gorgons. They were still marching in tight ordered ranks in amongst the tanks, seeking what cover they could from the armoured behemoths, but exposed as they were from the close-range flanking fire that now opened up on them, hundreds died in seconds. The 7th Company had been caught squarely in the jaws of a Vraksian trap, and they would pay dearly for it. Unable to push forwards and unable to withdraw as well without exposing themselves to further fire, all the 7th Company could do was to hunker down, seek out whatever cover or concealment was available to them, and wait for nightfall, and then they could finally orchestrate a withdrawal from the approach towards the lower gate. And with the 7th Company's assault upon the supposedly lightly defended lower gate completely checked, there was no reason to devote any further reinforcements to that area from the Vraksian side. And so, when the 15th Company and the 5th Armoured Company began their advance up the narrow, switchback road towards the Great Gate, the defenders were fully ready and had plentiful reinforcements available to them. Nevertheless, an attempt had to be made. The 15th Company's Gorgons, carrying their grenadier elites, continued towards the gate in the lead of the assault. They, unfortunately, did not make it very far. Barely halfway up the approach, they were forced to halt and disgorge their grenadier complements, lest the Gorgons be destroyed utterly. Already, several of the lead transports had been knocked out, and had then been pushed off the switchback road to open up the path for the other transports. The grenadiers charged forward in a desperate attempt to reach the Great Gate, but it was all for naught. They were quickly bracketed and pinned by heavy automatic weaponry and near constant mortar fire. The 5th Armoured was then ordered in a last-ditch attempt to break open the approach, and maybe, just maybe, the Grenadiers could then form up and advance behind the Lehman Russ tanks. But despite a valiant effort on behalf of the 5th Armoured Company, that hope was swiftly shattered. Instead of swiftly moving upwards to rescue the Grenadiers, the tanks got stuck in just the same fashion as the Gorgon transports, Every time an armoured vehicle got knocked out, the next one in the line had to move up and use its dozer blade to push it out of the way. And subsequently, the tank doing the pushing was then immediately targeted by the very same anti-tank weapon that had just knocked out its fellow. And the best case scenario then was that the tank would gain a handful of precious meters before it too was destroyed and required removing. And far from rescuing the grenadiers, the tank crews found themselves in dire need of rescuing, as they were forced to abandon the one vehicle and then the other. The only company still making progress was the first company, but that too swiftly came to a halt as they ran into a as of yet uncleared minefield. The remaining Gorgons had long since been immobilized. The Grenadiers were now fighting their way over exposed terrain, whilst also being threatened by anti-personnel mines. And with them picking their way slowly and tortuously forward, all three of the first attacks had officially grind to a halt. The fourth and final company of the 261st was now sent in to aid the various advanced formations. The 15th and the 1st received the bulk of the reinforcements, whilst only a smaller force was sent to relieve the 7th. There were further companies and Death Rider assets standing by from other regiments, but they would only be relieved if there were signs of an imminent breakthrough, and the 261st could not have been further away from it. Nevertheless, the fourth and final company of the 261st moved up to support the advance elements, and for a time the fresh troops created a brief moment of forward impetus for the 1st and the 15th. But the reinforcements were unable to reach the 7th Company and open up a retreat route for them. If the company could have been pulled back and reorganized, another attempt upon the lower gate could have been possible. But in the current situation, the 7th Company simply had to hunker down in amongst the burning wrecks of their transports and tanks and hope for the best. The 1st Company would continue its offensive, although any true hope of breaching the Cardinal Gate had long since vanished. But by keeping up the pressure, the Vraksians were at the very least unable to free up substantial forces which they could have sent to the lower gate. If they had managed to organize a counter-assault force, then it was entirely possible that the 7th could have been overrun and thusly completely eradicated, turning an already disastrous situation into a truly catastrophic one. As for the reinforcements moving up to support the 15th, they had a bit more in the way of success. The road was so utterly covered in craters and blasted up armoured wrecks that they provided a considerable degree of cover to the advancing troops, although the officers moving up alongside them noted a significant demerit to this situation as well. There were dozens of armoured vehicles stranded and burning along the route. They had been pushed just barely out of the way, just enough for the following vehicle to get past it, and not clean off the sides as they had been instructed to do. It would appear that even the men of Krieg were at heart human, and being ordered to push the wrecked tank of your comrades, with your comrades quite possibly still inside of the tank, off a steep cliff, condemning them to certain death, was a hard order to follow, even for the Death Corps. And whilst the 4th and final company might find reason to appreciate that now that they were seeking cover from the enemy's blitzing rain of fire whilst they were advancing, the next force that was ordered up this route would not. The shattered wrecks of tanks formed a near impenetrable barrier of twisted steel and metal. Infantry could easily enough make their way around, over, or under the various wrecks, depending on whether or not they were on fire. But any armoured elements that would attempt to navigate this path in the future would find the going slow and tortuous in the extreme, as it would no longer be a question of moving a knocked-out tank out of the way of the next lead element, but instead moving dozens of twisted wrecks off the path. Wrecks which the enemy would have had plenty of time to toy with in the time between the assaults. The Vraxian defenders were far from shy when it came to creating booby traps, and a Leman Russ tank that would have to be pushed out of the way by other armoured elements? Well, pack a few large-bore artillery shells in that thing, along with a bit of a sensitive trigger, and you have quite the practical joke for the next poor bastard that wishes to move it. But that was a problem for somebody else, and the commander of the 4th Company had plenty of problems all of his very own as he led his guardsmen up the slope. They eventually hooked up with the grenadiers and the armoured crews that had bailed out of their tanks. The tank crews were ordered to join in the advance. They would not have the luxury of retreating and would have to grab their carbines and las pistols and move up as improvised infantrymen. Now freshly reinforced, the ad hoc formation consisting of grenadiers, guardsmen, and tank crews made another effort to push forward. The remaining elements of the 5th Armoured Company advanced alongside the infantry, and slowly but surely they began gaining ground once again. The officers of the 15th Company displayed incredible bravery as they stormed forward, raising their power swords as signals for the men to follow them, and the 5th Armoured, not to be outdone by the infantry, rushed forward heedless of the danger. The suddenly renewed impetus of the attack must have caught the defenders off guard, because their fire slackened, and the ad hoc formation made it to the small plateau just in front of the Great Gate. Of their armoured support, there was only now a handful of tanks left, 12 to 15 vehicles at most. The majority of the 5th Armoured Company was still stuck all the way at the bottom of the switchback road, unable to fit even so much as a fourth of the company on the path at once. Some 800 armoured vehicles were still standing by, lobbing relatively ineffective long-range firepower up at the Citadel's walls, whilst awaiting signal from the Grenadiers that the gates were open and they could begin rushing forward. Although, with all of the new obstacles, that might not be quite as much of a rush, and more of a slow, snail's pace. The commander of the 5th Armoured Company had already anticipated this and ordered Atlas recovery vehicles up just in case the rest of his tanks were needed. But for now, the remaining 15 vehicles of the lead elements would have to be enough to breach through the Great Gate and allow the Grenadiers' entrance into the Citadel itself. It looked like the 15th Company might just have made it. Through some miracle of timing or enemy carelessness, they had gotten all the way up to their objective, and all that was needed of them now was to breach it and swarm into the fortification. Once inside, the Grenadiers reckoned they had a more than fair fighting chance to hold out against any Vraxian counterattacks until further infantry companies could be brought up from supporting regiments. However, the real bad news for the 15th Company was just about to begin. The Vraxians had not been caught by surprise by the reinvigorated assault from the 15th Company. They had hoped for just such a happenstance. They had allowed their defensive fire to patter away just enough to give the enemy an opening, whilst not seeming too suspicious. And it was also partially due to necessity, as any mortal troops, be they Vraxians or Imperials, caught in the area once the Sanctified closed their trap, would be in dire peril, as the allies currently being summoned by the Sanctified were none too particular from whence the blood flowed, as long as it did flow, and appearing from the thin air and launching themselves off the curtain walls were a tide of demonic monstrosities, the 15th barely having any warning but for a slight taint of ozone to the air and an unnatural crackling sound, found themselves under assault by hellishly red monsters, appearing in their midst, wielding meter-tall demonic blades that screamed as they sliced the air. Having already suffered horrendous casualties, the 15th was not prepared for such an enemy, especially not one appearing straight in amongst their midst. Quickly, their armoured vehicles began backing away, firing every weapon at their disposal, even if they might catch allies in the blast, knowing full well that to be sliced apart by one of those demonic blades would be a fate far worse than to be caught in the backblast of friendly fire. Some of the tanks panicked and backed up too far, falling off the edge of the small plateau. The grenadiers formed up in firing squads, levelling their hellguns at the approaching monstrosities and brought them down one by one with massed volleys of hellgun fire. And whilst their backpack power sources were being rapidly depleted, there was no other option than to keep up a hammering barrage on full auto. The guardsmen were faring less well. The Lucius pattern lasgun certainly has its merits, but its lack of a full auto or even a burst fire mode put it at a severe disadvantage when it came to putting down a charging hellish monstrosity armed with a sword almost as large as you are. Scattered officers were shouting out orders, desperately trying to reorganize their guardsmen in disciplined formations, where they could levy organized volley fire against the demons. It would leave them exposed to the remaining wall guns still firing down upon them, but they would die even more swiftly, scattered, unorganized and alone against the bloodletters of Khorne. And for a moment, it seemed as if they might just do it. The grenadiers had given the guardsmen precious seconds with which to get organized, and both groups were now seeking backwards to the protection of the hammering heavy guns of the tanks. But off in the distance, the great gate began to grind slowly open, and from within the citadel, a horde of hellish red juggernauts charged out, making the very earth shake beneath their tread. Against their thick, demonically armoured hide, the scorching beams of hellgun and lasgun fire were but pinpricks, and the handful of Lehman Russ tanks that managed to lower their main weaponry in time only knocked a few of them off their feet before the entire horde slammed into the remainder of the 15th Company. They tossed tanks away like children's toys, hurling them off into the abyss behind them, and they scattered the ordered formations of the grenadiers and guardsmen. Soon the demons were in amongst them, and began hacking and slashing them down to the last man. In the face of such a ferocious counterattack, even the discipline of the Death Corps finally broke down, and the remainders of the grenadiers and the relief company began to fall back down the slope and down the switchback road in complete panic. Though little did it avail them. Fleshhounds of Khorne were already leaping in amongst the fleeing men, tearing them down and ripping them to shreds, as the demons too pounced after them and the juggernauts rampaged through their fleeing lines. Within minutes, the 15th Company's 20,000 men and the 10,000 men of the relief column were no more. No fighting formation, but a scattered handful of shell-shocked and terrorized survivors that one by one slowly trickled down the slope and into the protecting lines of the surrounding regiments. With the demonic counterattack shattering the 15th Company and the elements of the 5th Armoured, the assault upon the Great Gate came to an end. As night slowly fell across the battlefield, the 1st Company and the light infantry elements also began retreating from the battlefield. The 7th Company could also finally begin to withdraw its troops under the cover of darkness. All in all, the 261st had been mauled beyond even the most pessimistic of expectations. Lord Hector Rex had expected the regiment to be able to continue to assault for at least a few days. Instead, it had been utterly and completely shattered within the very first day. The 15th Company, originally 25,000 men strong, had been practically eradicated, with just a few hundred being rolled into the other regiments of the 30th Line Corps. Of the grenadier elements dedicated to support the 15th, they were practically dead to a man, having held their ground in a desperate attempt to cover the retreat of the company, and of the 5th Armoured Elements also sent to support it. They, too, had simply ceased to exist. All in all, the attempt upon the Great Gate had cost the Death Corps of Krieg some 30 to 40,000 casualties. All of the armoured elements that had not retreated prior to the demonic counterattack was lost. The Gorgon transports, too, lost. And the crew served heavy weaponry, the autocannons, the rocket launchers, the heavy bolters, mortars and quad launchers brought up to directly support the advance, lost. For the 7th Company, it had hardly been much more of a pleasant experience. Having been pinned down and shattered almost from the get-go, the ragged survivors had spent the entire day being shelled and constantly bombarded by automatic weapons fire in plunging fire positions. Out of the original 20,000 guardsmen, barely 5,000 remained to withdraw when night finally came. Of the 5,000 men operating the crew-served weaponry, they had fared somewhat better, being behind the main advance. The reinforcements, unable to break their way to the 7th Company, also was mostly undamaged. As for the 1st and the light infantry, they too had been mauled, though nowhere near to the same extent. They had suffered a mere 30 to 40% casualties. And as it tends to be with the Death Corps of Krieg, the Officer Corps had been particularly heavily affected. The Death Corps officers, always leading from the front, always trying to make an example for the rest of the men to follow, had been cut down almost to a man. Of the higher command corps, there were none left. The whereabouts of Colonel Tyborg was unknown, though none had seen him fall. But for all intents and purposes, his regiment was done for. Virtually all of the commissioned officers had died, and command of the 261st fell to the senior-most company quartermaster, who had survived by sheer virtue of the fact that his calling kept him in the rearward lines of the fighting. The 261st was deemed combat ineffective. And previously, during the earlier phases of the siege of Vraks, when reinforcements were plentiful, it would have been pulled off the line and sequestered in the rearward areas, where reinforcements could be prioritized for it and an entirely new officer corps could be organized. But right now, there was no such time nor luxury. The remains of the 261st would be rolled into the other regiments in the 30th Line Corps, though the 261st regimental number would remain in the 88th Army Book, if for no other reason than to honor their sacrifice. As for the rest of the 88th Inquisitorial Siege Army and Lord Hector Rex, this was not ideal. The defeat of the 261st had, frankly, never truly been in question, but for it to have been so swift and comprehensive was quite disheartening. The final citadel was always expected to have been a tough nut to crack, but more progress than this had been hoped for. And ever painfully aware of his political opposition, Lord Hector felt the need to produce more favourable results swiftly, and so he moved up his own bold masterstroke. The next offensive would be led by the Inquisition itself and would feature the services of the Red Hunters Adeptus Astartes. They would be deployed in a manner similar to that used by the Red Scorpions, but they would receive the additional support and direction of Inquisitors in the field. It would be a considerable roll of the dice, this plan, but if successful, it might just crack open the citadel in one fell swoop. Preparations were already underway, and the initial planning had already been done. The cooperation of the Red Hunters had also been secured. They were always more than willing to assist the God Emperor's Inquisition in any way possible. regardless of how optimistic the plans may have seemed. Now, Lord Hector X had gotten away with some damn optimistic planning up until this point, but this newest ploy of his... it makes all the other plans look downright pessimistic by comparison. But that will have to wait for the next video. Until then, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Have a good day.